Hello, welcome everyone to the sixth session and also the concluding session to the Who is My God Interfaith series, where we collaborate with the Network of Spiritual Progressives in Australia and along with the Center for Interfaith Understanding in Singapore. So it's a collaboration that brings together experts as well as scholars in the field of interfaith. And we have been exploring five themes throughout this session, ranging from commitment, humility, empathy, interconnectedness, and hospitality. And of course, these are frameworks for interfaith dialogue that has been proposed by Professor Catherine Cornell, who is with us today. And she will be providing more insights into the framework, particularly with today's focus, which is on hospitality. So my name is Imran, and I'll be moderator for this. And this whole series has been curated by myself and also Dr. Adis Duderija from Griffith University. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to have a very good session today. Let me just first introduce the speakers that we're going to have today. Of course, we're going to have Professor Catherine Cornell, which I will introduce later. And we also have Rabbi Jonathan Karen Black. And Rabbi Jonathan is rabbi at the Leo Baeck Center for Progressive Judaism in East Kew, Victoria. And he is also a founder member of Green Faith Australia and JECO, which is the Jewish Ecological Coalition, which has now morphed into the Jewish Climate Network. Rabbi is frequently a valued spokesperson for ARRCC, the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, and he served on the ARRCC committee for the last 7 years. So we are fortunate to have Rabbi today to share some of his perspectives on hospitality and truth, from the Jewish perspectives in particular. And second, we have, of course, my colleague, Dr. Adis Duderija, who is currently a lecturer and researcher at Griffith University in Australia. And he researched on issues pertaining to contemporary Islam with specific reference to scriptural hermeneutics, Islamic fundamentalism, gender, and interfaith dialogue. And he's also an activist-minded scholar and is one of the leading theoreticians of the academic theory of progressive Islam and Islam-West relations. His publications include the Sunnah and its status in Islamic law, the imperatives of progressive Islam, and Islam and gender, major issues and debates. And last but not least, we have Dr. Katira Sankhe, who is a founding board member of the Center for Interfaith Understanding, or CIFU in short, based in Singapore. He has been engaged in both interfaith work and in working towards the spiritual upliftment of the Hindu community for more than 20 years. He is traditionally trained in the Hindu school of Advaita Vedanta and received his PhD in yoga, philosophy, and meditation from the Hindu University of America in 2021, which is quite recently. So I will introduce Professor Catherine Cornell later on, who will give concluding remarks as well as observations from the presentations today. But first, let me invite Rabbi Jonathan to deliver his presentation. Rabbi, please.
Thank you so much, Imran, for the invitation. I want to first say how good it is to be speaking with you tonight, and that I'd like to welcome you all to the third night of the festival of Hanukkah. So welcome. I want to just share with you the candles, if I will. Hope I can move forward. There we go. So it's the third night of Hanukkah, and most people are aware of Hanukkah, and because although it's technically a minor festival in that it's not ordained or even known of in the Torah, it is a very popular and well-known one with children and also with public figures. And giant candlesticks are sometimes erected in public places. This is in Federation Square in Melbourne, and you'll know where that one is. And the cynical might observe that Hanukkah has grown to provide a balance to other commercialized festivals that fall at this time. Those who know about our Festival of Lights will also know about the miracle story that when the Jewish Maccabee group drove the Seleucid Greeks out of the temple and managed to rededicate it, that's what Hanukkah means, dedication, they found only 1 day's worth of oil, but miraculously it lasted for 8 days. Well, that is only half true. The temple was indeed taken over and desecrated by the Seleucid Greeks in 167 before the Common Era, but there's no written story of miracle oil until hundreds of years later. The real reason the festival marking the rededication lasted 8 days was most likely because they celebrated the festivals that should have happened in the temple a couple of months earlier, which was the 7-day festival of Sukkot, Tabernacles, followed by the 8th day of Solemn Assembly. The real miracle is not super life oil, though wouldn't that help the energy crisis and the environment? But the real miracle is Jewish survival. So each year we light the lights and celebrate the great miracle that happened there, Jewish survival. If we were gathering physically, I would be offering you sufganiyot. And sufganiyot are donuts, and latkes, potato pancakes, both deep fried in oil as a reference to the miracle story, the one that never really happened. Because hospitality, offering food and drink to guests, is a primary mitzvah or commandment in our tradition. The model of hospitality is taken from Abraham. Abraham, who, as you'll remember, rushes to greet the 3 strangers that he sees approaching in Genesis 18. Even though he was recovering from having just circumcised himself, he ran to meet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if I have found favour in your sight, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then wash your feet and recline under a tree, and let me bring some pita bread, and restore yourselves before you go on your way." They agreed to his modest proposal, and he then rushed out to his wife to start cooking a feast, and out to the field to select a tender calf, planning to present much more than the little bread and water he'd offered them. And then he served them with butter and cream sauce on the meat, and stood by them to wait on them as they ate. Like many of our stories, this one throws up a range of challenges for the commentators and rabbis. Did Abraham know they were messengers from God? Why did he serve milk and meat together? And so on. And I'm not going to describe the variety of creative answers they came up with. Nevertheless, it is the first example of hospitality, and as such it becomes the model for going out of the way to welcome guests. But we could pick up the question of kosher food in a slightly different direction. How far do we go to make our guests feel comfortable? For example, do we need to arrange kosher food even if we are not kosher ourselves? And even then, how kosher is kosher? Does it have to be strictly kosher just in case? And some Jews won't even eat strictly kosher unless it's prepared under their own supervision. So the rule that we are guided by here is to be clear. It's found as do not place a stumbling block before the blind. In other words, make sure that people know. So, for example, we have signs in the synagogue saying our biscuits are not supervised kosher, but do not contain animal products. I do not feel, though, that we have to be strictly kosher. That is not who we are as a progressive Jewish community. It is not highly important to us and would not be observed carefully by most of our members. There would be significant extra costs and limitations. This question can be applied in an interfaith context. We want to make sure everyone feels welcome. But does that mean we all have to be limited to strictly kosher meals, which would impose on everyone and which would double the cost and complexity of the food? When we have run interfaith conferences, we've tried being strictly vegetarian, but you might be surprised at the complaints if meat is not on the menu for 3 days. We've tried having only Jewish and Muslim friendly meats and not having dairy at the same meal. But though it is generally thought that Muslims can eat kosher meals but not vice versa, even that is not strictly correct, because Jews can drink wine, so might have a little red wine in the gravy or vanilla essence made with alcohol in the dessert. So even strictly kosher is not necessarily good enough for strictly halal. We generally end up with options to allow this, so allowing people who are worried to avoid prohibited foods, and separate pre-packed supervised kosher meals for those who feel they want this option. And this mention of wine reminds me of my first interfaith experiences, which were at a Jewish Christian Muslim conference held in Bendorf, Germany from 1984. They had a wonderful and carefully developed structure. People traveled to get there on Monday. On Tuesday morning they would have the Jewish keynote speaker address the conference issue, and the rest of the day was structured around discussing and reviewing what they'd said, and then the same on Wednesday with the Christian input, and on Thursday with the Muslim speaker. Of course, each faith got input immediately from the participants of all faiths, including their questions to the speakers, etc. Anyway, by the Friday, we'd been together for 3 intense days and prepared to learn about and share and experience the Muslim holy day, followed on Friday evening by the Jewish Sabbath, which went on through the Saturday, and then on Sunday the Christian Sabbath. A pretty intense and holy 3 days. On Monday we set off for home, tired but spiritually high and stimulated. However, that first Friday evening, as we sat down at the special Shabbat tables, I remember we got a briefing and explanation. Jews would welcome the Sabbath with a glass of wine, over which they'd say a blessing. They could use grape juice instead, but wine was preferable. But wishing to be good hosts, and knowing that Muslims could not drink wine, we have provided both bottles of wine and bottles of grape juice around the tables. The wine and grape juice were poured out, the blessings sung, and the Shabbat welcomed. Sadly, it turned out later, someone had set off a rumour that wine had been mixed into the grape juice, which of course it hadn't. The next year, learning from this sad experience, special instructions were given to those laying the tables: do not break the seals on the bottles. Let those who open them at dinner do that for themselves. Now a question arises from this, rather like the one I asked earlier. Do we have to be strictly kosher in the synagogue, or observe rituals in the strictest way, just in case anyone that observant wants to join in? Similarly, should they have scrapped the wine and just celebrated Shabbat with grape juice, in case any Muslims might be offended? Professor Cornell, in her Reflections on Hospitality, references Hick, I think critically, and says that some pluralist thinkers involved in the dialogue because between the religions reject altogether the use of religion-specific norms in the process of dialogue as patronizing, and would attempt to propose neutral norms agreed on by all. So I suppose they'd argue that only grape juice should be used. But indeed that would also lead to kosher food cooked with no alcohol, so that it too was acceptable to everybody present. To be fair, the original context is more about language. For example, in a Christian service with Jews present, do they remove the Jesus qualification, as in fact they have in the Lord's Prayer that I heard read today in the Australian Parliament? And I suppose my answer would be, it depends. The prayer in Parliament is meant to apply to extend hospitality and welcome and inclusion to all who live in Australia, or at least all who can live with the idea of some higher power or spirit of the universe, even if not a Father in heaven. And whilst I'm certainly happy not to conclude it through Jesus Christ our Lord, it clearly remains inappropriate and therefore inhospitable to polytheists and atheists, and should consequently be changed. By contrast, though, at a respectful interfaith conference where different faiths share their services, it can be welcoming and hospitable to use your regular language, and expect others to do likewise when they welcome you to their prayers. However, if you can practice in a genuine way and adjust or choose more inclusive language, that would also be good. I appreciate that Professor Corneel is talking about hospitality as a mindset and an approach to dialogue, being open to learning, recognizing truths in people of other faiths, and she says towards integrating that truth in one's own tradition. I'm not so sure that this last needs to be accepted as a necessity. For those new to interfaith, it may seem too much to ask, but I do think if we are hospitable to others, we must be open to learning from them and about them, and not trying to force them to be like us, or believe or act the way we choose to. By the way, I learned long ago that we don't engage in interfaith work to learn about other faiths. That we can do from books. We go to learn about how people of those faiths act and believe. We learn about Jews more than Judaism, Christians more than Christianity, and Hindus more than Hinduism. Let me conclude with an interesting example. At a Jewish Christian Muslim conference on hospitality, we asked, how long does your tradition require you to be hospitable? Can someone outstay their welcome? We learned that the Muslim tradition has a graduated approach. On the first day, like Abraham, you kill a calf. On the second day, a goat or a sheep. On the third, just a chicken. After that, I believe there is no further obligation. The guests should have got the message. I hope my memory is correct. Anyway, I liked it and came home and found we have a very similar teaching in our own tradition. We also learned that you should escort your guest down the road or into their carriage and not just out of your door at the end of their visit. I don't know if we have the same teaching, but I wouldn't be surprised, because these are measures of decency and common sense, and all our traditions are full of them. And besides, they've always learned and borrowed from each other. Anyway, ever since that conference, I have accompanied guests to their car. It's a good tradition, whoever it was to begin with. And I will finish there so I don't outstay my welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you this evening.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Of course, there's a lot of interesting things that you raised, but I like the last point that you made about, a lot of these things actually, it's about decency, it's about common sense, it's about borrowed as well as shared tradition. I have a couple of questions though pertaining to food in an interfaith setting, but we'll bring that to the question and answer later. Right now, let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Adis Duderija from Griffith University. Dr. Adis, please.
Thank you, Imran. I'd just like to share my screen. Could you please enable my sharing? I need permission to share.
Yep, you can do that now.
Thank you. All right. As the title suggests, my presentation is going to focus on the idea of hospitality to truth in the Islamic interpretative tradition. So not necessarily the Quran or the Sunnah, which are the normative sources. And I'm going to provide a brief overview. My presentation is going to be merely descriptive, with the focus on this idea of the salvific efficacy of the religious saga. And my aim is to merely provide an overview of the wide spectrum of opinion and various perspectives on this question within the Islamic interpretative tradition. But before I do so, I would like to present the thoughts of Professor Cornell on this issue. This is my own interpretation of Professor Cornell's thoughts in this regard, although I try to be as objective as possible, and I have included one of the main quotes that I believe speak most closely to what I would like to talk about in my presentation. So what does hospitality to truth mean? Basically, it is a process whereby we recognize the truth in another religious tradition and the ability to integrate that truth in one's own tradition. And that's what Rabbi also mentioned earlier on in his talk. The second point is that Professor Cornell makes is that out of all of the conditions that characterize constructive conditions for interfaith dialogue, which has been the theme of our seminars throughout this year, the most crucial or sole sufficient condition for constructive dialogue, according to Professor Cornell's theoretical framework, is this idea of hospitality to truth. And in one of the most important passages from one of her numerous publications on the theoretical, in relation to interfaith dialogue theory, is this one that highlights this idea that the most crucial or sole sufficient condition for constructive dialogue is indeed hospitality to truth. And finally, another important passage or another important thought that kind of caught my attention in relation to this question of hospitality to truth is that this quality of hospitality need not necessarily entail recognition of truth in all religions or every dimension of a particular religion, but it could merely pertain to certain aspects or dimensions of them. This is how I understood Professor Cornell's theorizing to be, and I could be wrong, and I stand to be corrected later on, perhaps. So with that in mind, I would basically like to spend the rest of my time to talk a little bit about this idea of, as I said, salvific efficacy of the religious saga from the Islamic interpretative tradition. Now, in order to, before I outline the wide spectrum of opinions on this throughout Islamic interpretative tradition, both classical and contemporary, I need to perhaps discuss I need to have a preliminary, there needs to be a preliminary discussion about and trying to understand the what I call the contextual relationship between the Muslim religious self and the religious saga based on the available academic evidence. So before we can really intelligently discuss this question of the salvific efficacy of the religious saga from the perspective of the Islamic interpretative tradition and why there are opposing views, perhaps, we need to appreciate this idea of the contextuality of this question and the importance of recognizing context in when trying to deal with this question. So before trying to arrive at this question, what should be a normative kind of approach? What kind of normative approach should Muslims take to this in relation to this question? We need to keep in mind a number of important factors, if you like, or we need to take certain things into consideration. The first one, of course, is the idea, and that tends to be sometimes forgotten especially by Muslims themselves, is that the Islam that was the historical experience of Islam with the founder or with his historical founder in the persona of Muhammad arose in a context that was already marked by the existence of several well-established religious communities, especially Christians and Jews. And this fact is very much reflected in the Quran. We know that many, many passages in the Quran refer to episodes, narratives, personalities that we share in common with our Jewish and religious counterparts. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. In other words, Islam did not arise in a religious or historical vacuum, like any other religion for that matter. And therefore, another important factor or a thing to take into consideration is that the Quranic attitude that we find throughout the Quran, or in many parts of the Quran, it's actually one of the major themes of the Quran. And what we would call the Muhammadan praxis or the Sunnah towards the non-Muslim other is highly contextual in nature. So we find, and this is a well-known point, especially amongst academics, that we find certain Quranic verses to be speaking very highly and praising, the proponents of other religious traditions, especially Jews and Christians, whereas other ones tend to be very critical. So that is because of the very much a dialectical nature of the Quranic discourse. Yeah. And therefore, we could say that Quranic approach to this question of the religious other could be termed as at least somewhat ambivalent. So it is difficult to say that the Quran has just one mode of relating to the religious other. Yeah. And another point that I would like to emphasize is this idea that for much of the early Muslim community's existence, and by that I mean during the life of Muhammad, the community, the budding Muslim community, for basically 80% of the time when the Prophet Muhammad, from the perspective of the Muslims, of course, existed, 80% of his career, if I could use that term, was in the context in which Muslims were under existential threats. Even when he migrated to Medina, the Muslim community, that early Muslim community, was still very much vulnerable physically. Even their survival was not assured. Therefore, one could argue that many of the passages in the Quran pertaining to the Jewish and Christian communities, not only theologically, should not be seen only through a theological sense, but also through a kind of a political, military sense. Yeah. And therefore, some of the less positive views that we find in the Quran pertaining to the non-Muslim other could be a result of that specific context as well. There is also a lot of literature that has come out of in the academia that tries to shed light on early Islam, here meaning the first century of Islam, first century and a half perhaps, which is still in many ways are not well researched, or let me put it this way, primary sources for the first 100, 150 years of Islam, there's very few of them apart from the Quran. So it is difficult really to say anything equivocally as to what was really going on at that time. But some of the literature that does exist on this question seems to be pointing to the fact that the actual Muslim self-identity and this idea of confessional distinctiveness was a process that took many decades, if not a century, before there was, let's say, a large degree of stability or what it means to be a Muslim occurred. And one of the famous publications in respect to this question of consolidation of Muslim self-Muslim identity and this idea of this idea of growing confessional distinctiveness of a Muslim comes from the professor of historian of Islam from University of Chicago by the name of Fred Donner, who has argued that really the early Muslims, and by that he means Muslims living in the first half to first 3/4 of the first Islamic century, did not really have a well-established independent sense of the Muslim self as being radically different from especially the surrounding Christian communities. There seems to have been a lot that they have shared with them, especially theologically. So he has argued, for example, that in early Islam, the idea of a believer or a mu'min could also be applied not just to Muslims or those who are following the footsteps of the historical Muhammad, but also to many Christian and Jewish communities, well-established Christian and Jewish communities of that time. Which brings me to the last point, which is this idea that the idea of Ua religion, or the idea of the primordial religion that we also find referenced in the Quran, should also be taken into consideration when we consider this question, normative relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other. The idea of belonging to the community of Abraham, who was who personifies this, let's say, pure religion, if you like, the Ua religion. And as one of the students of Islam, Jacques Wadenburg, writes in one of his many works, he poses this important question as to, when we look at the concept of this Hanifiya religion or the Ua religion, the primordial religion, it is not clear, if we look at the Quran, it is not clear whether or not, as the quotation suggests, whether or not the historical Islam should be conflated with this more abstract idea of Hanifiya or that Ua religion. So before we can really come up with an answer to the question of what is the normative relationship between the Muslim self and the religious other, I would argue that we really need to think carefully about all of these points. And different Muslim scholars throughout Islamic interpretive tradition have taken different positions, partly because they part ways or they answer these questions, or they examine these factors from different perspectives and come to different conclusions. All right, so I will just, for the rest of my presentation, I will quickly make reference to some of the recent works that have actually looked at this idea of religious pluralism and salvation of the religious other. One of them is a study done by Professor Muhammad Khalil, published nearly 10 years ago. He did an extensive study of major Muslim Sunni scholars in particular, both classical and contemporary, and he has argued that intellectual giants like Al-Ghazali seem to have been a quasi-inclusivist when it comes to this question, basically emphasizing the idea that God's mercy will prevail, and that all the people, regardless of their kind of reified religious identity, will end up you know, saved. Whereas some other Muslim scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Jawziyah, they were much less accommodating and basically said that salvation is restricted to Muslims only. Another important study was done by exciting young Muslim female scholar who has studied this question of the salvific efficacy of the religious sada as well, and she basically says that when it comes to certain scholars such as Ibn al-Arabi, the famous Andalusian Muslim scholar who was both a philosopher and a mystic, basically he was very much a pluralist in relation to this question, as was the famed Rumi. Yeah. Finally, I have just selected a couple of quotes from what I in my theoretical, in my work on academic theory of progressive Islam, I would consider Professor Sakidina as a proponent of progressive Islam. In this quote, he reminds us of one of the factors that I mentioned earlier on, that when it comes to the Islamic tradition's approach to pluralism, he reminds us that the Islamic tradition had found expression in a pluralist world of religions, which it acknowledged, evaluated critically, but never simply rejected, never really rejected as simply false. Yeah. So it is kind of, what he's trying to say here is that there isn't a straightforward answer to this question, if you like, of the religious efficacy of the religious sada, salvific efficacy of religious sada. And finally, let me end with this quote of someone who would become, or someone who would be a proponent of radical pluralism within the Islamic interpretive tradition, Professor Abdul Karim Soroush, who kind of turns this question on its head and surprises us by saying that no one has considered the possibility that this unavoidable plurality of interpretations, conceptions, and sects, to which no religion is immune, might have some other meaning and significance. Maybe it means that this pluralism is itself desirable. Maybe rightful guidance is broader than what we had imagined. Maybe salvation and felicity hinge on something else, something beyond the antagonistic and divisive dogmas and particular conceptions. And Professor Abdul Karim Soroush has actually developed a very systematic theory of religious pluralism from the Islamic, within the Islamic framework. He looks at it from an epistemological as well as ontological perspective, but I don't have time to go into that. So basically, I would like to conclude by saying that when we look at this question of the normative relationship between the Muslim self and the religious sada, there are many factors to take into consideration, and as a result of that, the scholars, both classical and contemporary Muslim scholars, have answered this question in very different ways, partially because they had a different perspective on those 6 or 7 factors that I mentioned earlier on in my presentation. So there is a broad spectrum of opinions, from exclusivists to inclusivists and radical pluralists. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adis. Again, there's a lot of insights that you have provided, especially when looking at the formative period of Islamic thinking on this subject, and also looking at the interpretive tradition, who actually constitute part of the community that interprets in a particular manner, and looking at the context of history. And you did mention Fred Donner, which a fascinating book about how early Muslims were actually tied through this idea of community of believers. And it was later during the dynastic period that there was a more exclusivist move towards defining the self in relation to the other. And of course, the Crusades played a very important role in that self-image and self-definition that puts two communities now on opposing ends. I think those are issues that are worth exploring, especially when we think about what it means to be having hospitality in the midst of all these self-identities. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Kathirasan. Hang on here. So Dr. Kathirasan, it's over to you now to bring us through some perspectives maybe from the Hindu tradition, please.
Thank you, Imran, for the introduction. All right, my presentation today is going to be in the form of questions as well. I'm going to look at hospitality from the way Indic traditions have observed them. And that's going to be my key focus for today's presentation. All right, so now a couple of things that I'm going to look at is also to look at some primary sources as well, apart from secondary sources, in trying to see how hospitality could be perhaps looked at from different perspectives. And I would like to open my presentation from this direct quote from Catherine, from that article, where she says that the final and sole sufficient condition for dialogue involves recognition of actual truth in another religion and hospitality toward integrating that truth in one's tradition. I was very attracted by this particular statement. And this allowed me to also look at the validity of this particular statement through the Indic lenses. So let's now look at perhaps antecedents that we have in the Indic traditions where we see this hospitality, or sometimes what I call as a reciprocal assimilation. Now, we see this very early in the Indic traditions, especially between a very interesting or perhaps a very well-known popular school of thought within Hinduism, which is called Vedanta, or specifically Advaita Vedanta, which is perhaps popularized very much by a teacher by the name of Shankara. So we see early reciprocal assimilation between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. So you can see as much as these two traditions have been very much competitive, because there's lots of dialectical works criticizing each other, which is found in both the Advaita Vedanta texts as well as Buddhist texts. But yet we see something very interesting. When there was a great idea or a truth contained in each of this tradition, or even a metaphor, which can be very, very powerful in conveying a truth. Now that was actually, that has been assimilated in these traditions. A simple example is a very famous metaphor and analogy that is called the rope and snake analogy. That's found in both Buddhism and Vedanta. And they're used particularly in the way people make what I call as psychological errors, or even errors in understandings. So in that sense, you can see that even two competing traditions have actually assimilated each other's truths in the sense. So that's one thing that we find here. And also frameworks for truths. I'm talking about even epistemological frameworks, which I'm going to talk about shortly as well, where we see that both of these traditions share. And we don't know who started these ideas, right? Because there are scholars who take both views, in the sense that it could have started from the Vedantic traditions, or it could have started from Buddhist traditions. But the fact remains that they have actually influenced each other. Now, the other tradition that we see is also Hatha Yoga. There is also a recent evidence that we see that there is also a reciprocal assimilation between Hatha Yoga and Buddhism. Now, again, by the term Hatha Yoga, I'm not referring to those postural yoga practices that have become very current in the last century or so. I'm talking about Hatha Yoga as a spiritual and a religious yoga practice that involves effort. So there too, we see, again, a reciprocal assimilation, again, a kind of a hospitality where these two traditions found truth in each other. And then there is also another interesting, perhaps less popular reciprocal assimilation between Islam and Hatha Yoga. So we see in the medieval times where Persian translations of Hatha Yoga teachings and texts that have been so-called made from translated from an Islamic perspective. So you can say it's like an Islamization of yoga that we see in some very unique texts, like, for example, Amarta Kunda. And certainly all of this that I'm sharing qualifies the validity or rather qualifies the statement that Catherine had, that I quoted earlier, which shows that people find truth in each other's traditions, and that actually influences the way that they present it to various audiences. Now, the next thing that I'm going to talk about is actually a structure for truths that we find in the Vedantic tradition, as well as, if I'm not wrong, even in Buddhism, this is also found. It is like an epistemological framework to validate truth. Now, it is usually done in this in the tradition through threefold, like a threefold approach to validate truth. Now, the first one is called pratibhasa in Sanskrit, which means a private truth or a private reality. Now, this is one way of validating truth, which means that these are truths that are seen just by a person. It's highly subjective. For example, dreams, like what you dream, I would never be able to experience it, however much you may describe it. So this is part of the first, what I call categorization for truth, which is called pratibhasa, which is entirely private. Now, the second category of truth is called vyavahara. And this refers to conventional truths as well as empirical truths as well. Now, this is very interesting. This is where we see the validity of truths that are not entirely subjective and also not completely absolute. Now, this is where we see the pluralistic nature of religions. Now, vyavahara, in this sense, conventional, while it's a Sanskrit word used to denote the variety of practices, the variety of beliefs, and even the fact that they have a variety of traditions within Hinduism, as well as the Indic traditions as well. Hinduism is not a monolithic tradition in that sense. But yet, this conventional aspect of truth tells us something very interesting, because it tells us that there is a conventional truth that is found in all religions, which is very much applicable even to other religions as well, because these refer to the religious injunctions that we see, or the rituals that are promoted or that are encouraged for the followers to practice, observances. And one interesting thing is the duality that is contained in conventional truths, which is very much emphasized in the Indic traditions. So one of the clear, what I call descriptor for conventional truth is the fact that it is bound by duality, meaning that there is no absolute what I call truth to this type or category of truth. So this also means that all our identities, now regardless of what faith we may belong to or we may identify with, now they can be classified as part of this conventional truth, in the sense that they are true, but they may not be absolutely true. Now this therefore gives us a structure, so to say, to categorize truths. Now this leads us to the next one, which is the last one. The last categorization that the tradition, the Vedantic tradition, as well as Indic traditions present is paramartha. Now, this refers to the absolute nature of truth, or sometimes I would say even the absolute truth, of course, through the lenses or through the conventional structures, right? But there is also a connection between the conventional and absolute. The only way to the absolute, through, as per the Indic traditions, is through the conventional, right? Without the conventional, what I call practices or truths, or its validity, one cannot arrive at the absolute, which is called the paramartha. So here we see a very interesting, what I call depiction of truth, which is that the truth that is presented, or reality that is presented here in this category, is that it is undifferentiated, it is transcendental, and is not within the scope of the human mind or any kind of human intervention or deliberation. And yet, a very important qualifier, yet it is only known through the mind alone. Now, this is very interesting. A reality that is not bound by mental conceptions and yet known through the mind. Now, that is called paramartha, or the absolute. Now, here we see a very, very interesting interpretation of this, and especially in the last 150 years or so among Indic scholars, which is that because this absolute reality or the truth does not belong to any kind of conventional descriptions or categorizations, therefore, it may mean that this is something that is very, what I call a radically, what I call as a radical hospitality, learning the word from Catherine here. It's a radical form of hospitality in that sense, because in this state or in this reality, the conventional ideas, descriptions all fall away. And therefore, here is where we see that this radical hospitality, where everything becomes acceptable, in the sense that the absolute truth is now not bound by conventional definitions or descriptions, tell us something very interesting about the very nature of hospitality. And I use this term, radical hospitality, from the standpoint of the absolute reality. Now, again, this absolute reality is not confined to the what I call descriptions or depictions of it. I would say that the last 150 years, as I just briefly said, we see scholars interpreting this absolute nature to be a reality that belongs to all religions. And there has been speculation around it as well, where people actually state, or scholars have interpreted, this absolute reality to be accessible to all faiths. Now, when the conventional structures are adhered to and observed, now this leads a particular practitioner or a follower to this absolute state where there are no more identities at all. So when a person actually goes to this particular state or experiences this particular state, then there is no such thing as Hindu. There is no such thing as being a Buddhist. All right, those identities fall away. Now, could this be a radical form of hospitality? That's a question that I have. Now, this further, we see some of these depictions or descriptions in the commentarial works in the Indic traditions about these, what I call categorizations of truths that we just discussed earlier, a few seconds ago. Now, here is a direct, not a direct, but actually a very interesting idea that Shankara is a very important teacher in the Vedantic tradition. Now, he makes a very interesting point in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, where he says, scriptures or injunctions now become useless after freedom is attained. Now, here the word freedom refers to moksha, all right, which is a soteriological goal for in the Indic traditions. So he takes this very interesting view, which says that the moment freedom is attained by a person, scriptures, injunctions become useless. Now, the implication is great here. Now, the moment scriptures and injunctions become useless, identities also fall away. Now, this is a very key point that I would like to stress here. The moment they become useless because the goal has been attained is like saying that the boat is not useful after you cross the river, right? It's like saying that. So this is a very interesting thing. And then he further qualifies something else. He says, however, in spite of attaining freedom, conventional reality continues to exist. A very interesting perspective. So here we see a very interesting dance or a balance between the absolute and the conventional. Now, here, this leads us to many more questions. Could the absolute then inform the conventional? That's a question. Now, could that relationship lead to greater hospitality, perhaps? Now, these are questions that we can possibly think about. And then in the next slide, I'm going to share with you a quote from Shankara's grand teacher, meaning his teacher's teacher, from the Mandukya Karika, which is a commentary on Mandukya Upanishad. So here, Gaudapada says a very interesting, he in 2 verses, he makes a very interesting point of this relationship. Now, take some time to read this, as I'm going to read it out as well. Now, the dualists, firmly clinging to their conclusions, contradict one another. The non-dualists find no conflict with them. Now, interesting, I'm going to take a pause here. So here, by dualists, we can look at the conventional truths as they are. He says conventional truths can tend to contradict one another, but from the absolute perspective, there is no conflict, he says. And then further, since non-duality is ultimate reality, here non-duality meaning absolute, duality is said to be its effect. The dualist sees duality in both absolute and the relative. Therefore, the non-dualist position does not conflict with the dualist position. Now, this leads me to the next question then. Now, we have seen a very progressive approach where the conventional leads to the absolute. But here's another question. Could the absolute influence the conventional? could the absolute experience or the appreciation of the absolute in all faiths, in all religions, now could that inform the conventional, thus leading to greater hospitality? Now that's a question that I have, and perhaps it remains to be answered. And we have, fortunately, we have glimpses of this possibility through some great exemplars. Now, one of them is certainly Dara Shikoh. Many of you may already know who he is, right? A prince. So Dara Shikoh was a great exemplar here because he wrote a text that brought the Upanishad or the Vedanta tradition of Hinduism, as well as the Islamic tradition together in a particular book, looking at parallels. In fact, he certainly was an exemplar for hospitality in this case, or possibly even a radical form of hospitality. And also a little more recent than Dara Shikoh is Ramakrishna. Now, Ramakrishna is also an exemplar here. He taught the validity of all faiths. And the reason possibly he could find a place in his vision also could be his own realization, which also, when we look at his biography and his recorded works, we see that he made very clear that actually what he saw was the absolute in the conventional. Now, that was very unique in Ramakrishna's what I call case. Now, with that, I end my presentation with this question. Now, could there a possibility of the absolute informing the conventional, thus leading to a greater hospitality, or even the absolute being a radical form of hospitality? Thank you.
Thank you, Gatil. Interestingly, I'm currently also reading the Mandukya, and many of what you mentioned is something that I'm grappling also, especially with the philosophy of non-duality. And I wonder whether Dr. Adis later on would like to engage that from the standpoint of process theology and see how actually they differ or they are similar. But thank you so much for bringing us through those ideas, especially on reciprocal assimilation and structure for truths. But I'm wondering whether instead of radical hospitality, what you had presented is actually radical pluralism. But that's something that we can discuss later on. Yeah. So right now, after hearing from the three speakers, we will go to Professor Catherine Cornell, who will give her remarks and also her response to what has been presented, and also to give some concluding aspects for us to think about, especially since today is the conclusion of the sessions that we had, and using the framework that she proposed as a basis for interfaith dialogue. But a little bit about Professor Catherine first. Professor Catherine Cornell is Professor of Comparative Theology at Boston College, where she holds the Newton College Alumni Chair of Western Culture, and her areas of research focus on theology of religions, comparative theology, interreligious dialogue, and religious hybridity. She is the author of The Impossibility of Interreligious Dialogue and Meaning and Method in Comparative Theology. And of course, she has many other works under her name, and that includes edited volumes such as Many Mentions, Multiple Religious Belonging, Christian Identity, Interreligious Hermeneutics, Women and Interreligious Dialogue, and the chief editor of the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Interreligious Dialogue, and also Atonement and Comparative Theology. So really, she is one of the leading global experts on interreligious dialogue, and we are very fortunate to have her here today. And she's also the founding and managing editor of the book series Christian Commentaries on Non-Christian Sacred Texts. So we will be very fortunate to listen to Prof. Catherine, especially since it's 6 a.m. now in Boston. And thank you so much for waking up so early to join us in this session, and hope we can have a good time engaging you after this. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Imran, and thank you, Dr. Duderja, for inviting me to this series. And also, it's such an honor for you to be using my conditions for dialogue as a guiding theme through these different lectures. So it's really wonderful to be with you and to share some thoughts on what we've heard before this morning, and then to enter into conversation with you. So as you've heard, the theme of hospitality is a very useful one to talk about interreligious dialogue because it can be used in so many different ways. So we've heard the term hospitality used in a very literal way by Rabbi Jonathan, and then in a much more metaphorical way by Adis and by Dr. Katirasan. So there are all these different ways in which we can use the term hospitality, and in each use of the term hospitality, I think we see that that this category is also quite challenging and ambivalent. So there's a lot of potential in using the term hospitality, but there are also challenges in using the term hospitality, or at least the term hospitality shows the tension in interreligious dialogue, or the difficulties of interreligious dialogue in fully recognizing the other as other and maintaining one's own identity or one's own integrity as a religious person. So these two are, I think, the term hospitality shows how these are always in tension. And in Rabbi Jonathan's presentation, I think it was very clear when you talk about hospitality as commensality or eating together, what the challenges are. So the literal understanding of hospitality as welcoming someone into one's home, sharing a meal together, is in some ways a very basic form of hospitality that all religions implore upon their followers. So hospitality is a virtue or a value in all religious traditions. And so, I mean, the example was already given of Abraham receiving the three strangers. Hospitality in the New Testament is also something that is constantly repeated. My favorite quote from the New Testament on hospitality is from Hebrews 13:12, which goes, quote, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing that, some may have entertained angels without knowing it," which I think is a beautiful quote. So, you know, in Matthew 25, also at the Last Judgment, you know, hospitality towards a stranger is also one of the things that will lead to judgment on the last day, and so forth. So it's also very central in the New Testament. It's of course very central in Islam. Few cultures are more hospitable than Islamic cultures, I think. So it is a kind of universal virtue and very basic to human beings and to our need for food, for shelter, for community, and so forth. So giving and receiving hospitality in that sense is very basic, and it's beautiful how it's also a reciprocal matter, how both giving hospitality and receiving hospitality can shape us spiritually, can help us grow spiritually. Giving hospitality as a form of sharing love, sharing concern, sharing compassion, but also receiving hospitality is a very fundamental religious attitude. It opens us up to the other. It makes us vulnerable in very important and rich ways, I think. So all of that, I think, is part of the literal understanding of hospitality as giving and receiving gifts from one another. But then we've seen with Rabbi Jonathan all the challenges also to practice interreligious hospitality. What kind of food is being offered? Who prepares it? What kind of prayers are being said before the meal, after the meal? When we receive religious others in our homes, what do we do with religious symbols that may cause offense to the religious other, and so forth? So immediately, even though it's a very important religious virtue, literal hospitality immediately presents challenges in interreligious context that have to be addressed. And as Rabbi Jonathan pointed out, there are no hard and fast rules for how to deal with this kind of question of how to solve the question of what is served, how to act, what to pray, and so forth. I think this is something that in every interreligious gathering will have to be determined according to the circumstances. So this is one type of hospitality understood in a literal sense. Another, there are, in fact, I would say 5 different ways of understanding hospitality. So in the literal sense, commensality, but then there's also ritual hospitality that goes a little bit further than just praying together, but actually inviting the other into one's place of worship. And worshiping together, really praying together in public spaces, but even more inviting the other into one's own temple, church, mosque, and so forth. How do we act then when we are invited into the religious space of the other? It's again on the part of the religious person a very generous way of sharing one's own faith and one's own beliefs. On the part of the guest, it's also a very generous way of wanting to learn about the other, because of course there's no better way to learn about the other than to actually see the other pray, or feel or smell the incense and hear the sounds of the chanting and so on. You can learn indeed about the other in books, but being in the religious space of the other gives a whole different understanding of the other religious tradition. So giving and receiving hospitality in that sense, I think, is a very rich also a way of interreligious dialogue. But that again raises all kinds of challenges, like when you go into the space of the other, do you pray with the other? Does a Christian perform the rakahs? Do you try to do exactly the same as the other does? Well, that presents all kinds of challenges too, because for one, often you cannot participate in everything that the other does from the point of view of a guest. If I am a Christian and I go into a Hindu temple, very often I'm forbidden to go into the Holy of Holies where the God is being worshipped, because that's only for believers. If non-Catholics come and share the celebration of the Eucharist, they are not allowed to participate in the Eucharist itself, which is again the high point of the ritual. So there are limits also to ritual hospitality that present themselves on a purely factual basis or doctrinal ritual basis, but also from the point of view of the non-believer going into the space of a believer. When you try to do as the other does, which is, I think, a basic principle of hospitality, how does that feel? It feels like you're faking it almost. If you don't really believe and you perform the rakahs and you don't really believe the way a Muslim believes, it feels ingenuous or disingenuous, I mean. It also may feel like a betrayal of one's own religious tradition if one participates in a ritual that contradicts some of the beliefs of one's own tradition. So I've often taken Jewish colleagues to Hindu temples, and for them it's very disorienting and uncomfortable. For example, just when the arati comes around, the fire comes around to bless oneself, does one bless oneself when the fire has been offered to gods that are forbidden from a Jewish perspective, and so forth? So it also may feel as a betrayal of one's own religion to fully participate in the rituals of another tradition. So there again, with ritual hospitality, there are all kinds of challenges. Then a special kind of ritual hospitality, and a very interesting one, I think, is what I would call spiritual hospitality. And there I refer in particular to the practices of welcoming that occur in monastic settings in particular. So intermonastic dialogue is a very advanced form of interreligious dialogue where monks from one religious tradition spend time in the monastic context of another religious tradition. So between Benedictine and Buddhist monks, that has been a practice for many years, and Buddhist monks living in Catholic monasteries, Catholic monks living in Zen monasteries for extended period of time and participating in their rituals and in their form of daily asceticism. That type of dialogue in some ways has been the most smooth and easy dialogue, insofar there are so many similarities between the monastic disciplines of monks in the Christian tradition and in the Buddhist tradition, and for that matter in the Hindu tradition, so that monks very easily sink into the rhythm of monks in another religious tradition. And that's, I think, something indeed very, very important to remember, that the representatives of religions that pursue the religious life in the most intense and radical way seem to be able to practice this hospitality in uninhibited or very little inhibited ways. I think that's also a lesson for the rest of us. If they are able to do that, then hospitality should be also more of a, or it should be a lesson for others that interreligious hospitality can happen at a deeper level than all of these practical challenges that I have mentioned so far. Pierre de Béthune, I don't know if you know him, he's a Catholic monk who has written this beautiful book in French, L'hospitalité sacrée entre les religions, where he goes quite deeply into this in spiritual hospitality. And he says, quote, "Dialogue of spiritual experience is not only possible, but also the most true and authentic and the key to all dialogue." So that's what he says about intermonastic hospitality. On the other hand, he also points out that there are also challenges even for intermonastic hospitality. And the challenge is always to maintain one's role as guest and as host, and not to lose oneself in this encounter where sometimes the guest becomes the host, because in the Christian tradition, hospitality is a matter of receiving Christ in the stranger. And so the guest in some ways becomes the host, becomes the teacher if you receive Christ in the other. But then how do the roles become interchanged and become blurred in a way that it can also upset the reality of hospitality itself. So it's interesting. I was looking at the Benedictine rule, and hospitality is a very, very important prescription in the Benedictine tradition. But it's also said that, so if a guest comes to the monastery, all order has to be adapted to receiving the guest. But the guest should, only the abbot should speak to the guest, and others should just welcome the guest, but not entertain the guest in a very elaborate way. So you have to, in some ways, preserve your own integrity, your own spiritual path, while also receiving the other. So it's an interesting tension, again, even in intermonastic hospitality. Fourth type of hospitality I would call hermeneutical hospitality, and I think that is what Adis was talking about from an Islamic perspective. So it's a matter of both interpreting your own tradition and interpreting the other tradition in the most hospitable way possible. So interpreting your own tradition insofar as it allows for openness towards the other. So in interpreting scripture, as we all know, scriptures allow for numerous possible interpretations, and it can be interpreted in an exclusivist way, or in a pluralist way, or in an inclusivist way. So the kind of hermeneutical hospitality would be a matter of interpreting your own scripture in the most hospitable way towards the truth of other religious traditions. But it also is a matter of then opening oneself up to interpreting the other tradition in the most generous and hospitable way. as we all know, we can easily pick on each other's traditions and accuse each other and compare sort of an ideal form of one's own tradition with a caricature of the other tradition. Interreligious hospitality or hermeneutical hospitality in this way would be to exercise the greatest possible generosity towards the other religious tradition and focus mostly on what is beautiful and true in the other religious tradition rather than focusing on a caricature of another tradition. So I think this is the kind of hermeneutical hospitality is what I have focused on, I suppose, mostly in my work on the impossibility of interreligious dialogue and the 5 conditions for dialogue, because in that book and in that article, what I was looking for was mostly how can we really learn from one another, not just sort of receiving one another and letting the other go, but really grow oneself through the practices of hospitality. And so, of course, the biggest obstacle for that is hermeneutical inhospitality. And so how can we generate a greater hermeneutical hospitality towards the other? And then finally, the 5th type of hospitality I would call doctrinal hospitality. And that is what Katira-san, I think, was talking about, where we not only express a generosity towards elements of truth of another religion, but really try to learn from other religious traditions. And as he pointed out, this has been part of religious traditions throughout their history, the ways in which Christianity has learned from Judaism and Islam from Judaism and Christianity. And then throughout history, religions have absorbed elements from one another traditions without ever giving credence to the other tradition. Well, what I think is proper in doctrinal hospitality is that we actually acknowledge the host, if you will, or the guest from whom we have learned. So when we learn from one another's tradition, we also give credence to the source. We say who and what we have learned from one another's tradition. And I think that is proper interreligious hospitality rather than just taking from one another without acknowledging this. So it's a matter of learning not just about other religious traditions, but also from other religious traditions and opening one's own, recognizing that one's own tradition is never finished and that one can also always advance in one's understanding of the truth through learning from other religious traditions. But and that is in fact what the discipline of comparative theology, which is my own discipline, has been trying to generate and cultivate as a kind of method for interreligious learning. But that's where the comeback is always, well, aren't you then just pillaging another tradition? Isn't this a new form of sort of colonialism where you use the other tradition for your own benefit and so forth? So from the perspective of the tradition that we have borrowed from, that's often the critique. And from our own tradition, the critique is often, well, you're just practicing syncretism if you are taking from other religious traditions and combining elements that don't always fit together with your own religious tradition. So there is still a lot to be ironed out, I think, in terms of doctrinal hospitality, where we borrow from one another or use the other tradition to advance our own religious truth. There is indeed a kind of generosity and a recognition of the other, of course, in that, but often the other tradition may feel uncomfortable in the fact that the host is taking from one's own religious tradition what might be the best in one's own tradition, or at least regarded as such by the religious other. So I think that in our various presentations this morning, all of these different ways of understanding interreligious hospitality have come out in very interesting ways, and it shows sort of the malleability and the flexibility and the usefulness, in fact, of this of this category to talk about interreligious dialogue. And it also, as I said, try to point out, shows the challenges of interreligious dialogue, I think, very, very clearly. There's a very interesting book by Amos Young on interreligious hospitality, where he talks mostly, I think, and rightfully, about hospitality as both absolutely necessary and impossible. So complete interreligious hospitality is in fact impossible, but it's absolutely necessary also at the same time. So we always have to sort of balance the two aspects of hospitality. And he talks ultimately about interreligious hospitality or radical hospitality, absolute hospitality, as an eschatological reality where we will really only be able to practice absolute hospitality at the end of time, when we are all welcomed in the reality of God, or however we understand the ultimate reality from our own respective positions. So those are some of the responses I have to the presentations, and I suppose we will now open it for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. My own two key takeaways is that I think it's important to for the idea of hospitality to our own tradition. So that is something that is often not talked about, which is also about the most difficult element of the doctrinal aspect of hospitality in our own faith tradition. And also the reciprocal nature is very important. Sometimes, we are eager in wanting to share about our own faith tradition, but we forgot that in that sharing, it contains also the necessity of learning from other traditions and being open to it. And of course, that also includes the important idea of being in the space of the religious other, and what does that mean, especially in our context. And the immersive experience is actually something that I think we need to think a little bit more. And I will put in this analogy of, like a tourist passing through another country that is foreign to me. We want to be the host country to be hospitable to us, but are we also being hospitable to them in the sense of trying to be immersive in that experience of how they live their lives and their food and their culture? Or do we always look for the familiarity even when we go into another person's country and we want to look for our own food, our own communities, pockets of communities there? That means we are not really immersing ourselves in that cultural practices there. So what does that mean essentially about hospitality? And I remember the Lutheran Paul Ingram talks about passing over, the idea of passing over, of being fully immersive in the tradition of the other, but also knowing that we are not there permanently and we'll come back to our own tradition, but enriched by that immersive experience. So maybe that is something that I would like to explore a little bit more, and we can talk about that later. But I'm also mindful that Dr. Adis has to leave. But I have a question for you, Dr. Adis, if you don't mind. You mentioned about the doctrinal aspects. Of course, there is this idea of exclusivism and inclusivism and pluralism, to use the neat typology popularized by Alan Rees, right? But there is also this idea that is quite prevalent in the Muslim community about tahrif or corruption and superstitionism. The idea that Islam supersedes other religions that came before that. And also about the idea of Islam containing the comprehensive, complete, and final truth. Now, if that is the frame of mind in looking at Islam, how do you then find hospitality to truths in other religions when Islam is already complete, comprehensive, and the final arbiter to what is truth? So of course, that goes into the whole idea of exclusivism that is quite noticeable in many Muslim societies. So wondering what are your response to that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm hiding in the toilet because my kids are asleep and I don't want to wake them up.
No, this year.
Catherine was very perceptive and astute when remarking that I was talking primarily within the framework of scriptural hermeneutics and scriptural hermeneutic related hospitality. And essentially what I from the perspective of the Islamic interpretive tradition, rather than kind of approaching the so-called canonical texts in an unmediated fashion. Regarding the issue of tahrif, this is a concept again that is found in the interpretative tradition, although perhaps its starting point could be traced back to the Quran. And again, just like when it comes to the question of the salvific efficacy of the religious center, we see a wide variety of points of view as to what tahrif means. Is it a question of contamination and kind of a willful disregard or kind of corruption of the scriptures, conscious and willful corruption of the scriptures by the clergy, which is what the opinion of some of the Muslim scholars is? Or is it a question of, not a question of preserving the actual original teachings, but distorting them by engaging in certain hermeneutical acrobatics, if you like, and kind of thereby departing from the more apparent or direct or meaning, if such a thing ever existed in the first place. So again, here we see a wide spectrum of opinions on this issue as to what tahrif entails and what it means. So is it about textual corruption itself, whether it is willful or kind of accidental, if you like, passive or active, and also does it operate at a level of interpretation of the meaning of the text or the text themselves? So there is no consensus on this issue as far as I know from the perspective of the Islamic interpretive tradition. The second point was in relation to the idea of Islam being a comprehensive faith. Am I right?
Yeah, being comprehensive, complete, and the final religion, and that supersedes other religion. Yeah.
Again, this is a so-called Islamic orthodoxy, what I call the Ghazalian paradigm that only matured in the 5th century of the Islamic calendar. We have alternative interpretations, and many of these types of ideas about comprehensive nature of Islam are based on a particular understanding of or approach to the idea or the concept of revelation itself, and what the function of revelation is in relation to not only kind of salvation and theology, but also the role and the scope of reason, the nature of ethics. So the Orthodox Islamic tradition, for a number of different reasons, adopted a very, I would say, a very comprehensive, let's say, understanding of the function and the role of revelation in relation to theology, ethics, and all of these questions, basically trying to read into the Quran many things that quite possibly from a less orthodox perspective one could question very easily. Some Muslim scholars that are more rationalists, that have been more rationalists, have argued that the Quranic revelation has a much more modest role to play when it comes to not only issues pertaining to ethics, but also in relation to, theology, even doctrine. And that's why it's not surprising to see that in the formative period of Islam, we see so many disagreements on many issues pertaining to the nature of revelation, what it means to be a believer, the concept of Iman itself. We see disagreements on the most fundamental issues pertaining to belief, which seems to suggest that really, despite what the Islamic Orthodoxy wants us to believe, the Quran is much more modest or more malleable, if you like, and it can accommodate a wide spectrum of opinions and beliefs that are not always, but often, even from my perspective, radically depart from what Islamic Orthodoxy eventually settled on.
Thank you. It also reminds me of the work of Professor Mahmoud Ayub, who recently passed on. May God bless his soul. And he has also written on this matter. For viewers who are interested, can explore some of these scholars, including Abdulaziz Hashidina that you've mentioned, Dr. Adis, Abdul Karim Surush, and many others. Thank you so much for that explanation and exploration. Katir, Dr. Katir Hasan, you mentioned about, of course, thank you for bringing up Advaita, Vedanta, tradition, Shankara, etc. It's really about non-duality, the focus of your presentation. But you use the term reciprocal assimilation. I'm wondering whether that itself is consistent with the whole idea of non-duality. Because the idea of assimilation, that means there's duality involved and one assimilates the other. Whereas the idea of non-duality, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about annihilation and realizing that there's only one reality and there's no really separation. And there's only one truth. So what does it mean when we say that we borrow or adopt other traditions, as what other presenters have posited? Because there was never any borrowing of or adapting, even because there's only one reality. It's not a separation of the two realities. And it is really the one and the same truth that manifests in different forms, but there's really no assimilation in that sense. So can you explain that further? Thank you.
So this reciprocal assimilation takes place at the level of the conventional truths. It doesn't take place at the absolute level. Now, that's an important distinction that we have to make, because as you have rightfully pointed out, by the term assimilation, we are already implying there is two, right? One which implies there is a reciprocal relationship. So therefore, when we talk about reciprocal assimilation, we're looking at the frameworks, we look at the methodologies, pedagogies. Now, all of that, there is always a kind of assimilation that we see. For example, I have shared how Buddhist and Vedantic scholars shared certain terminologies or even methodologies or even pedagogies or frameworks, metaphors, etc. And again, you see in the Islamic yoga texts, when it gets translated into Persian texts. Now, again, you see ideas have been taken, and then it is presented to a new audience. Now, it could be a work of compassion, for all you know, for the fact that the person who did this work found some value in it and wanted to share it with others. So as you can see, that's what I term it as reciprocal assimilation. It takes place at the level of the conventional truth. But what we're talking about non-duality here is and something that culminates in experience, a sociological experience we're talking about, where it is not a topic. When we discuss non-duality, it is still part of a conventional truth. Now, when we discover non-duality as an experience, that's when it becomes absolute. Now, that's when there are no more identities. And this is what we mean by the inspiration or behind the variety of ways in which one could approach non-duality. And that's one of the I think very popular position that the Advaita teachers in the last 100 years have taken, especially because of the contribution by Ramakrishna, right, Paramhamsa. Now, he had contributed he kind of created a great way to look at other faiths, and that allowed modern Advaita teachers, Advaita Vedanta teachers, to interpret this truth in a way that it validated, right, how to then make sense of the presence of multiple faiths in spite of that one being, one supreme being. Now, that's when we then reconcile that the non-dual being then is behind that creation of the variety. So that's another interesting thing, that if you realize the word Advaita means non-dual, it does not mean ekam, meaning that it is mono. It is not monism. Can you see the difference here? Now, it's a very interesting term in Sanskrit. They refrain from using the word monism, but they use the word non-dualism, because the word non-dualism then implies the presence of conventional reality, which means there could be diversity, a variety of faiths, a variety of beliefs. And this non-duality as a reality, it exists in spite of the variety. That's a big difference between the term monism and non-dualism. I hope that answers the question, Imran.
Thank you. I think that those are very useful to frame our understanding of what you have presented. Let us get to something much more mundane, or even at a more practical level. And I have a question for Rabbi, actually. Rabbi, you spoke a lot about the encounters with others, particularly at the everyday life level that involves food, for example. And I will also add, sometimes it also an aspect of intermarriages that occurs across community, and whether we are hospitable to that very idea of intermarriages also. Is it really about meeting the lowest common denominator when we are encountering all these differences, particularly in food, for example, since you mentioned about food, right? Like, let's have vegetarian for all, since that's the easiest, lowest common denominator. But again, the problem is we are overlooking some internal diversity, like even amongst those who doesn't take meat, there's also veganism, there's vegetarianism, which is quite different. And therefore, is that really a practical way of dealing with the diversity, looking at the the lowest common denominator? Or are we also talking about having choice and freedom? That means you have a buffet of things that leaves the individual to choose and partake. But then that will also encroach into the idea of offense and how we deal with offensiveness. For example, having beef amongst the food being served, which might be offensive, not necessarily always, but sometimes might be offensive to, let's say, a Hindu practitioner, to find beef being served, even though he or she may not partake it. Or having a pork table, even though a Muslim has choice in that table to partake halal food, but having pork served as a matter of choice is might be offensive to some. So, but that's the reality of how we deal, or how we live in a multicultural society, that we don't necessarily have to have everything in common that caters to all, but rather we have a buffet and we deal with the differences that we might encounter and might be uncomfortable with. So at a practical level, sometimes that happens. What will be your advice in such a multicultural and interfaith setting like that? Because I've heard interfaith practitioners just say that let's just have vegetarian and that will solve all issues. But then you also have Jains who will not partake certain food that are seen to be part of the vegetarian diet. Food with roots, for example, like onions. So that's the complicated thing of really trying to accede to the lowest common denominator. What are your thoughts on that, Rabbi?
So we have something called a Jewish question, and that was a Jewish question. I would say goodwill, really, in brief, which is not a Jewish tradition. I mean, the brief, not goodwill. We've had all sorts of, in practical terms, we've tried all sorts of different things over the years, as I alluded to. And, there was a time when we had everybody lining up for lunch, and I went to check the lunch, and it looked like there were shrimps in the rice. And I asked the chef, and she said, no, it's perfectly vegetarian. I know what the rules are. So I went back to my colleague, and I said, no, they are vegetarian. He said, if they are fake shrimps, they're the best fake shrimps I've ever seen. So I went back and asked again. And she said, no, they're vegetarian, you've already asked. So I said, can you just check the package? So she looks at the package. It was a frozen, bulk pack. Oh, you're right, it's got shrimps in it. So basically, and sadly, instead of being able to sit and eat together, we Jews had to wait back while she cooked some extra rice, so it was counterproductive. But these things happen in practical sense. You've got to have goodwill. That's why I mentioned the rumor about the wine. That's not the goodwill we're looking for. And so you have to do the best you can and trust. And I want to say, I'm not sure how mundane it is, but it's practical, that this is a really spiritual experience, the Jewish Christian Muslim week that I went to. It was the most powerful week in my training year, and I went every year for 5 years, and then I carried on going afterwards. At some point I started participating in the Muslim prayer that we were invited to, and I actually was down on my knees, and I've learned a lot about my own faith. And we have prostration once in the year in Judaism on Yom Kippur, and I didn't do it. It wasn't part of my tradition, and it felt foreign and uncomfortable. And now I do, because I realize it's exactly the same movements and actions, and lowering ourselves before the spirit of the universe. Similarly, I was invited to join in with the Eucharist at one point in this very open, trusting conference, and I did, because I saw for myself some echoes of a combination. At the end of our service we have what's called Kiddush, where the word Kaddish, probably like Islam, like Arabic, is sanctification. And so we have Kiddush, sanctifying and on Passover, the unleavened bread, wafer, and the wine. And just immediately before that, we have Kaddish, which is the same root, but Kaddish is where we remember those loved ones who have died. And it suddenly struck me that actually the Eucharist is a sort of combination of Kiddush and Kaddish that we have at the end of our service. And there, so I made some sense for myself, not to impose it on Christians, but out of faith and trust. And I remember the words became less significant than the sense of togetherness and common shared depth that we've been talking about this evening. So I think goodwill in approaching it with an open, hospitable attitude of learning about the other, respect for difference and diversity, then we can bring something back to ourselves and our deepening our understanding of our own faith and our world.
Thank you, Rabbi. And since you're also working on climate change issues and environmental issues, I'm also mindful that we have to show hospitality to the surrounding environment, to animals also. And I think sometimes that is one element of hospitality that we seldom talk about in interfaith setting. So thank you for the work that you do also in this area. There are two questions here, and I think they're quite interrelated, but maybe I'll ask Prof. Catherine first. This is a question from Fahima. Does interreligious hospitality, especially doctrinal hospitality, require an active presence of a pluralistic mindset that endeavors to recognize truth beyond one's own religious belief? Conversely, how will it work for people with a particularist mindset? They are open to learning about other religions without blurring the lines of what each religion is. So I guess, how do we deal with people who have that kind of thinking, that they're open to learn about other religions, but they are worried about blurring the lines between the religions? And what would be your practical advice to people who have those kind of difficulties?
I think that, thank you for the question. I think that indeed for genuine learning from the other, there has to be some kind of openness to the possibility of change and growth within one's own tradition. I don't think you need to call this necessarily pluralism. You can also learn from other religions as an inclusivist, and I would even go as far as to say you can learn from others even as an exclusivist, because exclusivism also comes in different shades and forms, and you can learn more about your own tradition as an exclusivist, while when you engage in with other religious traditions with a somewhat open mindset, you probably won't learn very much that's new from other religious traditions. So for someone to genuinely learn something new, there has to be sort of that openness to the possibility that one does not have the fullness of truth or the final truth in one's own religious tradition. So there has to be some kind of, I think, humility, doctrinal humility, as I call it, towards one's own or about one's own religious tradition. Yeah, I mean, that's to answer the question very.
Yeah.
Can I just put a quick response in that when we set up the Jewish Christian Muslim Association in Australia in 2003, we had to make sure it wasn't hyphenated, because people were hearing Jewish Christian Muslim as some new sort of synthesis religion, and it had to make it clear that it was Jews, Christians and Muslims coming together.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I suppose it, other than humility, it requires courage on our own part also to really go beyond our comfort zone. Yeah. So maybe interim.
I think just one more thing about that. I think it also requires a kind of community of believers that are open towards others and who can support that openness, in the sense that if one is alone in this endeavor, it can be very disorienting and maybe challenging. But if you are able to have a community of believers that share that kind of openness, you can also negotiate what you have learned with others within your own tradition that help you sort of avoid sort of the pitfalls of delusion or syncretism or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Having the ecology to support that exploration is necessary. Otherwise, yeah, you are right. It can be a lonely and scary journey also, if one were to undertake personally. Another question by Guat Kwisi, who is the chairperson of Center for Interfaith Understanding. Exchange of ideas between faiths, for example, like prayer beads used in various religious faiths. Is that an example of hospitality? For example, the Buddhists, the Eastern Orthodox also use prayer robes. Hindus use the japa mala. Catholics use the rosary, and Muslims use the subha. So what are your thoughts on those aspects as an example of hospitality, or will it even be an example?
I think it's, if you look at the history of the use of prayer beads, I think it's Wilfred Cantwell Smith that has pointed out how the use of prayer beads started in Buddhism and then was adopted by Sufis and then came into Christianity in the Middle Ages. So it is an example indeed of borrowing that has happened sort of spontaneously and unconsciously, and indeed borrowing as hospitality, as kind of ritual or religious hospitality without acknowledging necessarily the source. But it illustrates that we have indeed always borrowed from one another, and that religions have often developed ways of praying and ways of learning in particular ways that can be adopted by other religious traditions without diluting their essence. So I think that's also what is happening now today with Christians practicing yoga or practicing forms of Buddhist meditation, Jews doing the same, and so forth. So I think there's a tremendous amount that we can still learn from one another. And the use of prayer beads is sort of, you can say, an original example of how that has happened spontaneously.
Thank you. Rabbi, I just want to pick on your point you mentioned about no hyphen, but of course there are also people who identify with what we call today multiple religious belonging. So it's an hyphenated identity that they've chosen for themselves. Like Paul Nitter is one, a Christian Buddhist, if I'm not wrong. And there are many other scholars who also choose this multiple religious belonging as part of their way of positing that identities actually don't really have the exclusive boundary as how we imagine it to be, but rather, sometimes they cross on each other and they really have a lot of assimilation that you can't really call something in an exclusivist sense. Christian, Buddhist, Muslim. Many of the things are actually shared also. So what are your thoughts to that?
Yeah, so we have, I suppose, official positions and personal positions might not always tally. Certainly, there are plenty of Jews who are attracted to Buddhism, and the Jew and the Lotus sort of records that original contact and journey, and we call them Jew-boos or Boo Jews, I think, and I'm not sure that there's really a problem, because those I've met don't seem to see a contradiction in a meditative approach to Judaism. And then we have the problem with Jewish Christians. We basically reject the idea that you can be Jewish and Christian simply because Jews don't believe the Messiah's come and Christians believe Jesus is the Messiah. So the official position is that we wouldn't recognize Jewish Christians as Jews because they've rejected a fundamental principle of Judaism. But I think there's a bigger answer to that, which is that certainly within Judaism we're on the way into a third phase, which is where people define for themselves how they identify their religious framework, their spiritual framework, how they see themselves, whether they consider themselves Jewish, how they practice, and who they marry. And you talked in the previous question about intermarriage, and I didn't respond to that, but officially it's not a good idea. From a progressive point of view, we would say we want to be part of an open society, and people are going to meet and fall in love with people of other faiths. And what, to my mind, is important is that two mature adults have a conversation about what faith means to them and how they respond to it and the spirituality of the world. As long as they do it in a spirit of respect for each other, then I would wish them mazel tov. But that's not a common position. That's really a progressive position. So I think increasingly we are at a point now where you can't enforce religion on people. We need to be permissive and progressive and open and celebrate if anybody, in a sense, I think what comes away from whenever I go to interfaith activities is that we all have so much in common because we believe in some spiritual spirit of the universe, something beyond the physical human day-to-day earning a living, making a family and so on, and so we have a lot in common which we don't have with people who really reject any spiritual aspect to life. So that's my position at the moment. I think we're entering a new phase where you can't police people and control them anymore. We should celebrate any spiritual way of expressing yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Because there's also a question from Francois, which I think you have responded because he says that the ideal example of hospitality between religions is actually interfaith marriage. But you have touched on that. So I also want to read out a comment by Mr. Pillai, who says, God is like the sun. He does not shine to a particular order, but to all, equally irrespective of religion of one's beliefs. I guess that might resonate more with Dr. Kapirasan's presentation just now. Yeah, those are comments, and I think we'll just end with this one last question by Mr. Andrian. How do you deal with offering hospitality in service or hospitality in worship, actually, while some part cannot be done by others who do not belong to its religion? We talk about sharing that sacred space, but then sometimes there are exclusive sacred space that cannot be entered upon by those who do not belong to that tradition. So is that something that we just have to deal with it, we accept it as part of that boundaries of the religious faiths, or are there other ways of dealing with this? And even the idea of praying together might be contentious to some. Standing in one line, everyone invoking their own prayer, even that itself might be seen to be problematic from the perspective of some adherents of the faith. So these are practical issues that often one encounters in interfaith work, and maybe there are some ways that you can advise dealing with this. And I'll end by having maybe Katirasan first to respond, and then and including your concluding remarks, and then Rabbi Jonathan and Dr. Adis, I'm not sure whether you are able to comment. No, you can't. Okay, I understand. The context doesn't permit you to comment at this stage. But then, of course, we'll end with Professor Catherine to give your final remarks for today's session. So, Dr. Catherine?
Right. Thank you, Imran, for the question. So now this is, I believe there is a dimension of religion which is ritualistic in nature, and there is from an epistemological perspective, there is an unseen dimension. Now, we say that this unseen dimension is what makes religion not empirical, meaning that it cannot be measured, it cannot be demonstrated using science, which then makes religion something very special, because or else the epistemological frameworks or methods, means used in science would be applicable in religion. In this case, it doesn't. That's what makes religion very unique. So we call this I call this a very unique aspect of religion. Now, when it comes to, when we look at certain practices, certain observances that lean onto this very distinctive feature of religion, now that's when we need to be very discretionary as to whether this particular ritual, this particular observance has this particular unique dimension that makes it so distinctive. That would then, I would say, would require a discretion in this particular situation. Otherwise, in practices that, for example, there could be an act of charity that is considered to be a religious act, which sometimes may not belong to this particular category of what we call as unseen, mystical. Maybe an initiation is required, perhaps. Now, that's when we can open it up to anyone to participate, to get involved. And there is no, what I call scriptural injunction to say that one could not or one should not. And again, I must acknowledge that this is a very gray area, gray zone, because it's not very straightforward, because as we see more and more commentators, interpreters of scriptures, we see this line being shifted, over the ages. So I would say that this is something that I would say that is not completely cast in stone, depending on which text actually presents these injunctions. I think that determines, right, based on the epistemological frameworks that each religion has, and then we can then use our discretion to make that decision. Is this permitted or is this not permitted?
Thank you. I like gray areas personally because it allows room for us to explore and to play within that and to discover a bit more. Thank you for your discussion today. Rabbi?
I think there are lots of opportunities to learn from each other, to pray together. The fundamentalists are never going to want to participate because they think they have the sole truth. So that's the case in all faiths. We all have this panoply from very open and progressive minded and hospitable to other ideas, to those who think that they have the sole truth, so everything else is wrong if it doesn't agree with them. So that's just the reality that we live in. But I think perhaps I should finish by again thanking you for the opportunity, and also pointing out that as I started with Hanukkah, Hanukkah is about Jewish survival, but the reality is that actually it was about a fundamentalist zealot approach to Judaism, which said it had the sole truth and everybody else was wrong, and we would die rather than accept Hellenism. And the Hellenistic Jews, who wanted to take the best parts of the tradition and integrate it into their lives, and understood and let their faith and their spirituality grow and survive. And so today, when we light the candles and celebrate Jewish survival, we're really celebrating what you're calling hospitality or openness, to diversity and to multiple truths, and to rejecting the idea that any one group has sole claim on the truth.
Thank you. Beautiful add to that. Prof. Catherine, that leaves you with your concluding remarks. And again, I must thank you for helping us think through many of these aspects of the interreligious dialogue. And of course, we are very happy to hear you conclude to the whole series today with your remarks.
Thank you very much. This is altogether too big a responsibility to conclude the whole series, but I will just give a few thoughts maybe. So first, with regard to the question of participation and the limits of participation, I think hospitality is also a matter of accepting and acknowledging one another's alterity. Just as we recognize the otherness of other human beings, we can also, I think it's a matter of respect to recognize the otherness of another religion and allow it to be other without necessarily having to participate in every aspect of the other tradition. So it's also a matter of mutual recognition and respect to recognize one another's alterity and not necessarily wanting to assume it or engage in every aspect of the other tradition. So it's a matter of recognizing one's role as guest and as host, and that those roles are different and not necessarily always interchangeable. So in some situations we are guests, in other situations we are host, and maintaining sort of proper roles in each situation, I think, is also an important skill to acquire and to preserve. So in that sense, I don't think there's a problem in recognizing alterity and respecting boundaries in interreligious dialogue and participation. So in terms of more general comments, of course, I wasn't privy to some of the conversations that were part of the earlier discussions, but I was asked also to say something maybe about how I see interreligious dialogue going forward, or what the future is of interreligious dialogue. And I just want to say a few things about some things that have also come up also in our discussion. And what I see happening are sort of maybe three different orientations or directions in which the relationship between religions is evolving. Rabbi Jonathan just pointed to two of them, and I think they are the two extremes. On the one hand, sort of the extreme of exclusivism leading to fundamentalism, where one holds on to one's own religious identity in a very reactionary way out of fear of the religious other. Because I think we also have to recognize that the reality of religious plurality and diversity is a threat to people's sense of identity and claims to truth and so on. So in some ways, I think we have to recognize that the kind of fundamentalist exclusivist reaction is not unintelligible or not unintelligent. It's sort of a way to preserve the coherence and truth of one's own religious identity. But I think one of the big challenges for interreligious dialogue is for people within their particular religion to engage the fundamentalists and exclusivists, and to try to open them up to the possibilities of interreligious dialogue without losing one's own religious identity. So I think that's one of the big challenges for the future of interreligious dialogue, is intra-religious dialogue between the different orientations towards religious others, and trying to overcome the fear of the religious other that is part of a fundamentalist reaction to religious diversity. The other extreme, I think, was also mentioned, and it's the kind of religious hybridity extreme, where individuals choose from different religious traditions to combine their own sort of religious coherence or their own religious beliefs. And that's, I think, something that is happening a lot especially in the Western world, where religious institutions are often losing their credibility, and young people are just sort of calling themselves spiritual but not religious, and combining elements from different religious traditions, which I agree with Rabbi Jonathan that there's something noble also in that religious pursuit, but it also means a loss. It means a loss for religious traditions with their own histories and continuities and integrities and so on. So my question for this kind of religious orientation is, how do then people celebrate together whose religious identity is constituted by their own choice? How do they celebrate together? How do they make sense together theologically or religiously of what is true and so on? So it becomes, when it becomes so hyper subjective or individualistic, I think there's a loss to history, to tradition, and to continuity, to taking the tradition forward also, if one sort of abandons any sort of commitment to a particular religious tradition. So those are the two extremes. And so I think in the middle is sort of the position of religious commitment and identity, belonging to a particular tradition with its own history, all its ups and downs and problems that one has to come to terms with, but with a kind of faith and openness towards what one can learn from other religious traditions and grow forward. And as we grow forward with a kind of openness towards one another, I believe religions also grow closer together as we learn from one another towards that kind of eschatological future when we will all be one. But as we do it sort of slowly, I think we have the possibility of negotiating the two extremes, of speaking to people who are on the one hand sort of fundamentalists and on the other hand have sort of abandoned their religious commitment or identity. And I think in that internal dialogue within religions, there's also a possibility of integration and moving forward, I think, in a more systematic and coherent way, where one doesn't lose the riches of tradition but remains open towards the future. And I see mostly the challenge of really making sense of the importance of commitment for the future generations. At least that's the situation that I'm in the United States, where I'm teaching, young people who less and less identify with any particular religious tradition. And so that's, I think, the challenge for the future. And they will only, I think, be able to make commitment credible if it's a commitment that has an element of openness. And so I want to also applaud all of you for your work as in the kind of progressive orientation of religious traditions for the possibility of doing this kind of work towards the future. And those are my final thoughts. Thank you very much.
Indeed, the challenge that you mentioned is real. Even here in Singapore, we are increasingly seeing that it's not possible to engage fully in interfaith dialogue without looking at the intra-faith dimension and the diversities within a particular faith, including its contestations. And I think many of those has been fleshed out throughout these 6 sessions that we had. And it's very important to think of ways in which we can be inclusive to the differences beyond just our comfort zone. And that is one of the objectives of Center for Interfaith Understanding, to bring these kind of conversations to the front so that we have a better way of dealing with the deep plurality and deep diversity that we have around us. Maybe it's also useful to think not in terms of being host or guest, but rather as pilgrims in a journey, that we are all pilgrims in a journey, and how we deal with each other in that journey speaks about our own attitude towards diversity, towards the ultimate truth, which we are all are interested in our own ways. Yeah. So thank you so much. And on behalf of Center for Interfaith Understanding and also the Network of Spiritual Progressives chapter in Australia. And of course, Dr. Adis, thank you for staying back so late. And to Rabbi Jonathan for staying back so late. What time is it now in Australia? I think it's way past 10, yeah. And also Prof. Catherine for staying, waking up so early at 5 a.m. and staying throughout. But I think it's been a real great conversation today. And Dr. Kathirasan, also thank you for all your insights. And Dr. Kathirasan is a valuable colleague of mine at the Center for Interfaith Understanding. And we are also bringing these conversations forward within our own circles to see how we can leverage on the useful points that have been derived from the 6 sessions. Of course, the sessions are all available online, so feel free to just share them with your networks. And Prof. Catherine, I will send you the link again, and you can watch the previous presenters discussing some of the aspects of the points that you've brought up also. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for staying up so late or waking up so early. And we hope to engage you further in future events like this. And Dr. Adis and I are planning for a series of conversations on process theology, hopefully, from the various faith perspectives. And that is something we want to explore a bit more. Thank you so much, and have a good morning, evening, wherever you are. Goodbye.